give everyone a little chance to tune in. I think we're going to get a lot because everyone's at home, hopefully, doing the right thing.
Yep. Well, hopefully, and of course, a few questions whizzing around the place.
Absolutely. So if you're rewatching this later, guys, we'll give everyone a few minutes to tune in. And it looks like it's just going live now on YouTube. How was your day anyway, Martin?
Yeah, pretty good. Pretty good. A lot going on.
And any interviews or anything in particular? Any gossip? Can you still hear me? No?
Yes.
Like any interviews, any gossip, any behind-the-scenes news to give us?
Hang on a minute. I've got a bit of delay and I'm hearing it live. Just a second.
You're right.
She's driving me mad. Hang on a minute. Let me just try and find it where it is.
You have to mute the one that you're watching, the second one, the chat.
Just trying to find it now. Hang on. I got too many windows open. Okay, let's mute that. Mute. Yay. All muted.
Is that better? I don't want to be echoing for you.
Well, it's of course it's not just immediate echo. It's sort of 10 seconds later. So it's like I say something and then I hear it coming back. It drives me nuts.
Audio visual issues are all sorted.
Yeah, I'm the right size as well. That's good. So you know.
And if you're watching at home, guys, sometimes you do have to refresh the stream for it to begin as well. So it looks like we've already got over 100 watching, Martin, which is good. And everyone...
We'll see whether you can get over 900. That I got on my last live stream, I got 920.
I think maybe a PB for us is probably in the crypto market, in the height of the bull market.
I was surprised. You know, it's quite amazing. And just a lot of people had a lot of questions, so it's good.
Absolutely. Well,
hello to everybody on the stream. Good to see you all here.
Most of you already know Martin. I'm just going to bring it up on another screen here, Martin. I've got 3 screens these days, and Ben's got a 4th one over there. So the office is not short of monitors.
Yeah, I've got 3 screens as well. So I'm watching you on one. I've got the chat and the web on the other, and then I've got myself just around the corner to make sure that I still look all right.
You're always looking good, Martin, especially now that you're not skinny.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Okay, guys, well, we will get into it. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and there's so much going on at the moment in Australia in particular, as around the world. So I guess, Martin, just to begin with, I wanted to recap because I've seen the subscriber growth on your channel as well. We've had 6,000 in the past week or so since this really picked up. And I want to give people just a really quick overview because everyone's sort of sick to death of hearing about what's going on. But I think taking it right back, how did we get in this mess? I think it comes back to the very fact that economics isn't a science. Like when we sit here and we do a maths problem or a science experiment and we have these properties and we have these answers and we can balance equations. That's not how the world of finance, economics, and investing works. And we've just had this huge buildup of debt. We've continued to borrow from the future. The global financial crisis should have been a wake-up call, and there's been some people sort of warning about it, that we can't keep doing this. And then we had a couple of pins that came along. The coronavirus is the latest one. It stopped everything in its tracks, and now we're just sort of left to pick up the pieces, aren't we?
Well, the point there is that the catalyst for the crisis, the financial crisis that we're now in, was the health issue, right? But if you go back before the health issue, if you go back to last September, right, the US repo market was already going crazy, and the Fed essentially had to start to bail out the repos last September. And that was the latest round of attempts to try and continue to pump liquidity into the system to be able to support the system. So we never learned our lesson from the global financial crisis 12 years ago. And essentially what's happened now with the health stuff is that it's really brought everything that we knew was going to happen at some point forward, because suddenly the economies around the world are screeching to a halt. And of course, what are the central banks doing? Well, they're pumping in massive amounts of liquidity. In other words, they're piling debt on yet more debt on more debt. And, the Fed this week said, well, we'll do unlimited quantitative easing. We'll buy anything. If it moves, we'll buy it, Yeah. So they'll be buying corporate bonds. They'll be buying junk bonds. they'll be buying shares next. And unfortunately, we've got this situation now where we've got the debt just spiraling higher and higher and higher at the time when unemployment in many countries is rising very quickly because of the freezing activities that need to be to try and stop the transmission of the infection. And so we've got these two forces, and there are lots of people who are saying, oh well, it'll be a short, sharp hit, U-shaped thing or a V-shaped thing, and then everything will be fine. Not sure that's going to be, because question one is how long will the freeze go on for? Some people are saying a couple of months, or if you're Trump, 3 weeks. Other people are saying, well, you've got to assume it could be 6 months, and to get to a vaccine, it could be as long as 18 months. Right? That's the first thing. The second is the longer it goes on, the more households and businesses collapse, fall into difficulty, get more and more trapped into debt. And so this isn't necessarily going to be a quick rebound at the end of however long this medical part is, right? At some point, presumably they'll solve that. Then it's a question of how slow or quick the recovery is. And that is the question that is unknowable at the moment. And that's why the markets are pretty concerned about what's going on.
Yeah, I think that the number one reason why the crash was so bad, and one of the reasons that we were able to probably see it before a lot of people, was because of that healthcare side of things, where a lot of the stock guys weren't taking this seriously when it was a few thousand cases and they were all in, Wuhan, and markets were just absolutely charging higher, and now they're starting to price that in. And there's two separate issues. There's the economy and the debt and the financial system, which needed fixing anyway, but now we've got this healthcare system where we're waiting to see, well, how can we stop it? And a lot of people are saying, well, stopping the economy is worse, but I definitely think I don't agree with that at all. If this spreads, remember, it's going to keep going around. Like, imagine just everyone just keeps getting the flu every year because we don't have a vaccine or a cure. You can't let this get out of control, and particularly in these developing nations.
Yeah, well, that's right. And it's interesting, the latest information out of Wuhan, where, of course, they started now to release people from their, their detention pretty much, is that starting to see the number of new infections rise. It wasn't just now people coming back from overseas. So this is the problem, right? Essentially, whilst you isolate people, you may be able to control the growth. But as soon as you start opening the taps again, it's still there. Because as you say, we don't have an antidote, we don't have a vaccine. And that's the terrible dilemma that we have. And I'm very frustrated with people talking about the trade-off somehow between the health axis and the economic axis, and well, you can't go too far down this side because if you do, then you're going to kill the economy. I would argue that the number one immediate issue should be to deal with the health issue, because if we don't get this under control, if we don't actually stop it dead in its tracks, and South Korea is a good example, I think, where they're beginning to do that now. This is going to go on and on and on, and that is going to be essentially a longer term thing. And the other interesting thing is that if you look at the sort of the trajectory of infections, it tends to go up, right, and then it sort of levels off, so it's S-shaped, comes down then, but often you then see a second peak later. So this ain't over till it's over, and that's what people haven't got their head around yet. So the economic consequences are dire, absolutely dire. But trying to trade off by keeping the economy ticking over even to low level probably is a fool's errand, because you haven't dealt with the critical health issue, which should be, for me, the number one priority.
Yeah, and people are still throwing around these numbers, the flu kills this many people a year. And I think in America it works out to an average of 150 people a day. And that sort of ebbs and flows in winter and summer. But what they're not grasping is that we're still growing at an exponential rate. So this week, the number of coronavirus deaths per day passed the flu deaths per day in America. But this is growing in America, it's doubling every 2 days this week, which is absolutely ridiculous, faster than what we saw in Italy. So today they passed China in terms of the number of cases. And if we hit that saturation point, which they're just starting to now in the New York hospitals, where the ICU beds overflow, all of a sudden those people that need to go to those beds, they become a mortality, and the death rate climbs. And then if the hospitals are overflowing, then the GPs can't deal with it. We're already running out of medications, and China stopped the exports of some of the promising drugs. So these are the things we're trying to work out. So it's very frustrating for me. watching these people trying to claim that it's not that bad because of the numbers as they currently stand, when these hockey stick curves are actually accelerating just to these crazy numbers, and within another 10 days, if America stays on the same pace as they were the past 10 days, it's going to be 1 million cases in 10 days, which is just nuts to think about.
Yeah, the exponential curve is horrid, right? Because it doubles, right? The other point, of course, in Australia, we have a very low ratio of ICU beds to the population relative to some of the other countries. So that's the other thing that we're going to trip over quite quickly, lack of available intensive care for people who need it. And then you start having to make terrible choices as they're doing in Italy. Who gets a bed and who doesn't get a bed? In other words, who's going to live and who's not going to live, right? And the other factor, of course, in all this is that whilst many people get it mild, some people don't. It is more infectious than many other, but the severe health impacts for a small proportion of the population, it ain't just the old people. It's actually broader than that. The trouble is that a lot of it's not fully detected and tracked yet. This is a deadly, serious problem, and I get frustrated when people say, "Oh, it's just like the flu." No. This is fundamentally different. It is, frankly, it's an existential crisis.
Yeah, you don't have to look any further than the tweets and the videos from the ICU doctors, nurses, all those staff, and the sheer numbers to 911 last night past 9/11 and whatnot. So the statistics are there if you want to read them. Just quickly, what can people do? The frustration in Australia this week has been around the kind of mixed messages and what's essential, what's not. Today we saw photos of, I think it was St Kilda Beach and over in WA, people still out on the beaches. And I mean, are they even allowed to be doing that if they're socially distancing? I think it's still a little bit unclear for everyone. I think Tasmania have just announced that they're going to encourage all kids not to go to school on Monday. They are going to make the exception for the healthcare professionals. So they are kind of pivoting it to like a sort of childcare service because they're not going to be teaching the classes to the kids that attend. So that is one issue that sure we have to solve. Maybe that has other problems, which I might get into later. If we're mixing all the doctors and then all the kids with the doctors and one of them gets sick and then all of a sudden all the doctors have it when they go home. But I definitely think we just need to bite the bullet. Look at what New Zealand did. They went to lockdown very quick. There's been a lot of countries that have managed this really well. I think there's a lot of uncertainty and mixed messages around masks. I think that they do help, even if it's just from you spreading it to other people. If you've an asymptomatic carrier where you don't have any symptoms, you don't know you've got it. But you look at those curves that are flat, Martin, they are the countries that went through SARS and they were all wearing masks. And when you look at our trams, our trains and Centrelinks, the Queensland voting polls tomorrow, and no one is going to be wearing masks, that's what worries me.
No, I agree. We haven't actually really taken it seriously yet, I think. And look, I go back to my point. There is still, I think, at the federal level, this economic trade-off, right? They're still wanting to keep as much of the economy ticking over as they possibly can. I think that's really, really a very dumb move. I think we should have followed New Zealand. Actually, I think New Zealand have done a lot better than we have. And even the UK, of course, who were at one stage talking about herd immunity, right? So they were actually going to deliberately allow the infection to run at a certain level. Yeah. They suddenly thought, oh, we can't do that. So they've actually really clamped down dramatically. I was talking to some people there today. They're not allowed to go out other than just, once a day, briefly. And it's all to stop the transmission, because if you can actually stop it dead in its tracks, then it's got nowhere to go. But if you leave one door ajar a little, it's still there and it will come back.
Yeah, and I think people get things wrong. Boris Johnson, bit colourful character, they really mucked up talking about letting everyone get it and try to get herd immunity and then backflipping to complete isolation. Whereas I think Scott Morrison is sort of refusing to acknowledge that they maybe should be doing some things differently, that he's got the messaging wrong, why a hairdresser's still open. He got really angry the other night at Australians, and then today he's congratulating them, yet they're all at the beach still. So he's trying to play this good cop, bad cop. I think everyone just wants us to bite the bullet. Let's do it together, for really good for 4 weeks, and let's try and beat it, because the delayed lag is the 14-day window up to 30 days until you really see where those cases are going to likely peak. And at the moment, again, the chief medical staff that are advising our government are really looking at these figures that suggest there's low rates of community transmission. And that may be true, but I think that it's wider than what we're seeing because of the community testing. And when I talk to my doctors, my friends that are on the front lines, until 2 days ago, the criteria were, you had to have returned from overseas or you had to be in contact with a known case. But all those, that's just such a tiny percent of the population compared to who's likely got it now. I think they've expanded those criteria. I think we're getting some more test kits. So as you've seen in the US, once they started testing everyone, the actual numbers have just rocketed higher.
Well, it's interesting. ScoMo said today 2/3 of the cases are from overseas transmission. In other words, people coming back to Australia and bringing it with them, right?
Yeah.
But that still means that 1/3 are locally transmitted. 1/3, right? And that's the concern. We don't know how much it is in the community yet because, of course, it's not tested at all. And so there could be latent pools in various places that people haven't come across. And because it's sometimes asymptomatic and sometimes very mild, people may not realize that they've actually got it and yet could be carriers. That's what we've got to deal with. And remember also that they found on the ship, I think the virus survived for 17 days on flat surfaces. 17 days. I mean, that's an amazing time.
From what I read about that was I think that the test that they do for that is trying to find the RNA of the virus. So that might not have been a live virus, but what we do know is that it can definitely survive on stainless steel and plastics for 4 days, which is a long enough time when people are using pens and keyboards at Centrelink, touching elevators, all your handles of doors and things made out of stainless steel. So 4 days is enough to do a lot of damage if people aren't washing hands really well, really thoroughly, self-isolating and doing everything else they're meant to be doing.
And just one thing to add, I was on the ABC Radio Sydney yesterday, and they were talking about all of these things there. And somebody called from some of the strata buildings and said, look, people are self-isolating now in those strata blocks, right, where they've got common lifts. So they're trying to restrict the number of people who can use the lifts, common areas, push the button to get in the lift and those sorts of things. And, very, very small areas for people to stay, because frankly, these strata blocks are more designed for coming and going rather than living there sort of, all the time. I think that our architecture, particularly in some of the major centres, are not going to help either.
I think that's why we've seen somewhere like New York just rocket from 10,000 to 100,000 cases, 200 policemen. And once it gets into those big concrete jungles, the cities that are all stainless steel and plastics and that's when it can spread. And because it's invisible, people just really find this concept hard to grasp. If it was fluoro blue and it was in the air all around you and over everything you touched, people would be freaking out, but they don't think about it like that. So that's kind of all I wanted to say. I don't want to go into that too much tonight, Martin. Maybe we can talk about the treatments and the cures, but anything you'd add to that?
Well, only just to say that Singapore, for example, is where they've got the same density. They've actually done very well, but they've driven the isolation and the controls much harder than here. And there's something about the psyche, I think, of Australians is, it's not my issue, it's somebody else's issue, right? We'll still go to the beach, whatever, right? Which is one reason why now people come back from overseas and now being locked in hotels for 14 days before they can be let back out into the community. But unfortunately, we can't be treated as adults because unfortunately there is a proportion of the population who don't behave like adults.
Yeah, and my wife is a teacher and her friend is teaching in Singapore. And when they say, Singapore's still got schools open, they've got, the thermal thermometers scanning your foreheads in between every class. They've actually got the thermal cameras in all the hallways and entries and exits. So it's constantly being monitored, AI tech and whatnot. They've got hand washing in every classroom, soap and water between classes. They've got a far better system. I don't think you can tell me that we're doing any of that in Australian schools.
Yep. No, we're not taking it serious enough yet. We will have to, but not yet.
In terms of the treatment and the cure, there's probably a bit of a positive there where we've seen some good test results around, you might have heard, hydroxychloroquine in combination with azithromycin, in combination with zinc as well. So we're getting into these studies where we've got to find at what steps of these pathways can we block the virus. That's one aspect of it, and ultimately we want this vaccine where we can find what antibodies can we attack or how can we get our body to produce antibodies against that virus. And those things tend to take a lot longer. There's already some early trials. We might find that China, without as much red tape as the Western world, they start to try a lot of these things, whether or not they have some more bad results because of that or whatever, but they might find something before us. But I just want to caution people that those medications are quite strong and they can affect things like your heart. So what we saw was doctors and even dentists just writing scripts for this medication as soon as Trump tweeted about it or heard the name of it. And those stockpiles are now depleted in a lot of places. It is a drug it's not made by one company now, so everyone can make it, but a lot of that's in India. As we said at the start, they've stopped exporting a lot of these drugs now, and people are going to realise, geez, maybe we shouldn't let China and India produce and manufacture 90% of particularly critical things.
Well, I think we'll have a broader conversation about extended supply chains and the risks around that as we take the conversation forward, because I think we're learning some really, really hard lessons about why globalism is actually not all it's made out to be.
Absolutely. Final thing I want to add to that for people, what can you do to stay healthy other than everything we've just mentioned? Get your immune system firing. I know it's hard to say go out for a walk and get some sunshine when people are trying to be isolating, but just being active and actually trying to get some vitamin D is really important. I am a believer in things like vitamin C, just eating really healthy. I've mentioned this plenty of times, getting in your vegetables, chili and garlic. These are things that are really good for your immune system. So look, that's what I'd be doing. Drinking plenty of water, just being as healthy as you can be. The same things that people think help them with the viruses like flus and whatnot. So
I'd just add one, sleep.
Oh, yeah.
I think that sleep is, my wife is very ill, as you may know, and in fact we're very concerned because she has an asbestos-related disease, which means that she's got breathing difficulties already. So we're being very, very cautious and careful with our isolation. But one of the things that we've discovered is that a lot of sleep makes a huge amount of difference.
100%. Sleep, very important. I should have mentioned that. And stress. So actually, studies have shown that even 15 minutes of just resting quietly or meditation, whatever you want to do, decreases your cortisol levels, your stress hormones. And when you've got high cortisol levels, when we actually prescribe cortisol to people, one of the things we tell them is that it's going to lower your immune system and you're going to get more infections. So this isn't sort of hippie nonsense, I'll meditate and whatever. This is science that getting those cortisol stress levels down, your immune system is firing better. Cool. So Martin, now we want to talk about what is the government doing? Because at the moment, we've seen some huge responses from over in America, but I still think that at the end of the day, you're kind of playing whack-a-mole a little bit. If you bail out one company, but then it lasts for 6 months, I think the focus just really needs to be on getting money to individuals, freezing those mortgages, freezing rents for not only individuals but for businesses. We just everyone needs to sacrifice and just sort of freeze those payments. And whether it's a Great Depression or not, we've just got to make sure that people can get by and they've got food on the table. They can look after themselves. That should be first priority before we're worrying about bailing out these companies that have been doing share buybacks and giving the execs huge bonuses.
Well, this is the big question, right? Because the Fed has done a huge amount of quantitative easing, and the 2 trillion, or was it 3.4 trillion, depending on how you calculate it, in the US that was passed through Senate and will become law. And just to give you a little bit of comparison, right, in the UK they've made a package equivalent of 15% of GDP, and the focus of the package has been to help households and to help businesses with cash flow. In other words, the government is effectively supporting that. So they're working at it from that end of the spectrum, right? And there are still issues in the UK with regard to self-employed people and gig economy workers, particularly because they don't necessarily fall within the standard employment structures. But 15% of GDP, right? In Australia, what's been announced so far is about 5% of GDP. So it's still on the cheap, right? And I don't know whether you noticed, but they were rather naughty when they announced the last package last weekend. They included the 90 billion that actually was the reserve banks.
I did read that, yeah.
Right. So in fact, they claimed it was up there, 10% plus of GDP. No. We are spending a third in terms of direct support to the economy. Compared with what the UK is doing. Now, I think the UK has got this much more right than we have. The other thing is that we are still in Australia wrestling with the idea that welfare is bad and we don't want to inflict welfare on people. So suddenly we're finding that jobs are dissipating, right? And yet still what we're doing is we're overlaying, minimalist welfare structures over what we've already got, a little bit up on where it was, but not huge. We're not actually doing what we need to do, which is to start from households and start from businesses and go from that direction. What they're tending to do is to give stimulus to the banks, so the banks can lend, so that people can borrow more, so that they can build their debts up. The banks are being asked to give mortgage holidays. I think we've got the structure wrong, right? Where effectively we've got the government at the top, big business in the middle, and down the bottom, the breadcrumbs are coming down to individuals. Should be turned around the other way. We should be actually directly supporting households and businesses, and we should not necessarily be chucking all the big dollars at the big companies on the principle that a lot of them got into trouble because they are debt leveraged. They haven't invested in what they should have been investing in. They've been doing share buybacks to drive their shares artificially high, and now suddenly they're all grizzling because effectively their businesses, because they're so leveraged, aren't able to function. We've got something fundamentally wrong here in Australia about the way that we're thinking about the level of support. Now, some people will hate this, but I think that the cleanest, most straightforward strategy here is to go for some sort of temporary universal basic income. So we actually get money direct to everybody. We can sort it out through the tax system later, and maybe some people will pay it back. But the best thing to do would be to get money out the door, because otherwise we're going to find that people essentially are going to get caught. The only way that they can actually survive if they're not working suddenly, because the unemployment rate is rising very quickly now, is to borrow. And of course, the thing about borrowing is you've still got to pay it back. And whilst the banks say, well, we've got offering very cheap rates and everything like that, it's not necessarily going to be enough. And by the way, credit card rates are still really high. A lot of people in my surveys, a lot of people are putting immediate expenses on credit cards, got no other choice. But that can't go on for very long. So there's an immediate need, in my view, to shift the dial to supporting businesses, supporting households, and readjusting some of the other things that people are thinking about. But it's a philosophical issue, I think, Alex. It's a philosophical issue because basically ScoMo and his team believe that welfare is bad, jobs are good, and that's where a lot of the issues come from.
So you're saying that if we were to go, right, everyone gets $500 a week, and then at tax time, the guy that earned 180 grand a year, he probably pays that $500 back. But that is better than guys falling through the cracks and going without food. These Centrelink processing, these are the things that worry me, how long it's going to take to get it right.
Well, think of all those queues. How many people in those queues were self-isolated? Right? It is nuts. And that was completely predictable, because the only way that you can get on these schemes is to actually connect to Centrelink. You try and do it online, but the web crashed. Well, there's a surprise. In fact, I know at one stage they were even blaming denial of service. Well, let's understand, denial of service can be created by just lots of people trying to access the website at the same time, right? The other option then is to actually go physically to one of the Centrelink offices. They're not actually structured for that, and of course they're also not necessarily fully staffed as well, simply because they're trying to self-isolate in the centres. So the whole idea is you've got to find a different mechanism, right? And of course, they said, well, the best thing to do is to use the Centrelink processes because they're already there and established. Well, we've proved they're not. Actually, you could use the tax system, or you could actually be a little bit creative and maybe even use some, a Bitcoin type thing, or some mechanism to be able to just get the funds out there immediately, so that people at least have a safety net. And that's another reason then not to get out and have to queue in long queues at Centrelink.
Yeah, America have got more of a headache dispersing all this money than we do. And I think the figures were throwing around, 6 trillion divided by the population comes out something like, 10,000 or 30,000, depend if you go on households or individuals or adults or whatnot. But they're giving out 1,200 is the number instead of, say, 12,000. So people are saying, where's that other 90% of money going? To corporations or businesses and to the guys that make 100,000 or millions of dollars a year. So again, the thing that Martin just mentioned, if we did this with, say, cryptocurrency wallets, if you got everyone to download a crypto wallet, everyone can do it. Most people have a smartphone or a very basic smartphone. And then you can send everyone a $1,200 payment, and they've got to use a digital ID. We've already got that sort of system set up in Australia, for example. And again, if someone ends up making 100 grand that year, you've got that information on the blockchain, the ID verified. If someone games the system, it's there forever. You can see where they sold their money or who they ID'd and whatnot. So there's going to be issues with everything you do, but I think it's very clear that sort of system, and American government and the Fed are actually talking to and hired people from Coinbase and these crypto companies, and they're talking about stable coins and Fed coins. So I definitely think they've got that seed in the back of their minds.
Well, it's interesting. And look, I've noticed on the chat, of course, there's always a huge reaction, negative reaction to UBI, because everybody says, "Oh, it's the end of the world. It's communism." No. Understand. I was talking to Guy Standing the other day. It's actually over on the DFA channel, right? It's worth listening to his chat about this. He is probably the world expert in UBI, and he makes the point. They've done real live pilots on universal basic income in a number of different countries. And they've proved that actually it can be economically more effective than other means. People actually don't stop working. They actually work on things they want to work on. That also increases education levels, and it increases social cohesion. And what it actually does, it redefines a little bit what it means to be at the top of the tree, because suddenly it's not how much you earn, and it's not, the solicitors and the lawyers and the bankers who frankly are at the top of the tree now and everybody else is down at the bottom. It turns the whole thing around. So there is, I think, some merit in understanding this a little bit more and not just knee-jerk reacting, say, "Oh, no, terrible." Particularly now, I'm only saying do it temporarily. Do it for the duration to deal with the specific issues we've got here, and then maybe think about whether it's something that should be part of a plan later. Interesting, in the US there's a lot of discussion about UBI as being part of the platform that needs to be developed into the future. So it'd be quite interesting to see how it
100%. And I'm not going to go into that today, but I don't think it's even really UBI in this circumstance. It's almost just like a modern day digital soup kitchen to make sure people have enough food
just
and shelter.
give them some money. Just give them some money so that effectively they can continue to buy food and buy the essentials. Doesn't have to be a massive amount, but that would actually solve a significant amount of the problem. Otherwise, you have to go back to the other route, which is you give money to the banks so the banks can lend people more and give them mortgage repayment holidays. And, then you've got to figure out with renters, what are you going to do with renters and how are you going to deal with them? And of course, they couldn't work that out. So they've now postponed that for a few more days than originally was intended. And meantime, the trouble is that if somebody who is renting from a property investor who has a mortgage and doesn't pay the rent, then that person can't necessarily pay the mortgage. So the chain works on. And I had somebody today say, it was a relatively elderly lady saying, "I rely on rental payments from my investment property to pay my cost of living. I don't have a pension. I don't have other savings. If that rent stops, I have no money." So these are horribly complicated issues to deal with, but I think you've got to start at the right end of the equation rather than the wrong end of the equation.
Possibly, and that's sometimes where the government, the sort of street smarts, the real world situations, game theory stuff is where it comes as an afterthought. Martin, I want to get through a lot of topics and take some questions, but let's do that now. Let's run through just quickly. I'll share my screen, a few of the questions that we had come in from our members, and then we'll take some from the YouTube chat as well. So someone was saying, when I put my super into all cash and defensive over a year ago, so when am I looking to redeploy that? Well, I think that we've still got another leg down, Martin. I think that this is still going to play out over more weeks. Just quickly, what do you think about that?
Well, look, I spoke to Harry Dent today. In fact, that shows up on the DFA channel. And Harry, he's the cycles guy, and he's the one who calls the view. His view is the markets have come down. They probably will go up or sideways a little bit, but there's another fall. So he's basically saying, sit on the sidelines, stay in cash for the next few months, because this hasn't yet got to the bottom of the cycle, right?
Yeah.
Partly because we don't know how long the medical emergency is going to run, and partly we don't know how much damage to the economy has been done and how long it will actually take to bounce back. But his view is wait, wait, don't start buying now, because essentially whatever you see in terms of a little bit of a bounce, that's just a temporary situation. It will come down again. He's saying this could go for 12 to 18 months. So his recommendation is go to cash. I don't give specific financial advice, but it seems to me that what he was saying made a hell of a lot of sense. I've gone to cash. I'm just saying I'm sitting on the sidelines, just wait and see how this plays out. Too many uncertainties, right? People are trying to value stocks without knowing what the future cash flows of companies are. Therefore, you don't know whether a stock is worth that amount or half that amount or a quarter of that amount. And there are too many variables. And there are too many traders, and there are too many computer algorithms running in the background that move the markets all over the place to really know where fair value is. So I just stay on one side, don't do anything.
Yeah. I was probably just I'm happy to miss the bottom by a little bit, because I think that this bounce, if you look at what happened this week, the cases in the US went from 10,000 to 100,000. Unemployment was at over 3 million, the worst figure ever by a mile, and the market's bouncing. That doesn't make sense to me, but hey, the market didn't make sense for 10 years, so anything can happen. Martin, we might do...
and you got to understand who's buying, right? So look at the algorithmic trades. And the point is, when there's a big move, right, up or down, all the algorithms kick in, and that reinforces the up and reinforces the down. And the market is, I think I just looked before I came on, the market is signaling a down day for the US now, about 5%.
Well, Martin, we might do rapid fire from now on, so 10-second answers.
All right.
Scenario, USD to inflate. This is a really common question we get. I think at the moment everyone is going to the safety of US dollars, like we've just spoken about, and then eventually all the chickens come home to roost. You can't have 20 trillion in debt and these huge stimulus and it doesn't come back to haunt you later.
Yeah, well, it comes to, where is the stable currency of the future going to be? Is it going to be the US dollar? Is it going to be the yuan? Is it going to be something completely different? Is it going to be a digital currency? All of those things are in play. But at the moment, the US dollar is the safe currency of choice by most investors around the world. And that's not going to change in the short term. Medium term, it probably will.
Similar question here about the different scenarios. So we're waiting to see, really, if we go to a new system. Some people are saying get back by gold again. I don't know if that's even possible. Bitcoin, a new stable coin, a basket of all the currencies. Honestly, every day is changing what the future might look like. So we don't know for sure yet.
No, but it's more likely to be a central bank digital currency rather than the Bitcoins of this world. It could well be asset-backed to some extent in some way, but it's too early to say. I'll tell you what, there's a lot of pilots going on in back rooms in central banks around the world. I expect to see developments moving very quickly here.
We've got a question about property. We might cover that in more detail when we do our big wrap-up next week, Martin, but I think your models similar are saying around 40%. That's kind of what you've been sticking to for a while.
Yeah, well, I've done the modeling again, 40%. Harry Dent says 42%. Prices will fall. Depends, again, how long does it go on for? How deep is the fall? But, my sort of best estimate of the main case is about 40% on average. Some places higher, some places lower. East Coast, higher, bigger falls. West Coast, because we've already 21% down, not as much.
For sure. Another question about the US dollar. We sort of touched on that. Mortgage and rent stress is an interesting one. If someone owns 20 properties, Martin, but then the rents and the mortgages are all frozen, personally, I'd be wanting to free up that capital and redeploy it into, say, stocks if they're down 50% or other assets. I don't know if I'd be wanting to hold on and service 20 properties. So what do you think about all that?
Yeah, there's a lot of people in my surveys with investment properties trying to get out. It's one of the sectors of the market that's still quite hot, simply because the economics of property investing is blown, particularly with no capital growth and with even with some of the payment holidays potential on some of the mortgages. Many people are trying to get out. They probably won't, but they probably should have 6 months. They should have listened to me. I said some time ago, get out while you can. It's really tricky. And of course, with the leverage situation there, if you've got multiple properties and you're all backing off each other, if prices start to go down, then effectively it's a spiral down. So it's a tricky situation.
I'd be interested in buying if we do have a deep correction, though, in the right areas and whatnot, but let the dust settle. So next up, why did the market bounce this week? I think we've touched on that. QE Infinity, $6 trillion. That's probably enough just to give it a little bit of a bounce when it's down 40% in 3 weeks, Martin?
Well, yeah, but the 2 trillion that was passed by the Senate also included an additional large amount to go to the major corporates, which means a lot of corporates that looked as though they might crash probably won't, like Boeing, for example. That's part of the reason. So some of the big companies really took off.
QE and relevancy to devaluation. We've already touched on this a bit, but it's really the velocity of money. At the moment, everyone is hunkering down and not spending. It's when everyone starts to spend, or when all the US dollars that are around the world as debt, when they come back to the US, that's when you can get inflation and turn into hyperinflation, which they've got to run that balancing act.
Yeah, well, what you're doing is you're basically, for a given set of assets, you're just throwing more liquidity at it. So effectively what happens is that the value of those assets might in theory go up because there's more money flooding in, but essentially it's not real. It's illusory, right? And that's the point about all of this. You end up with massive amounts of inflation. Look at Germany in the 1930s. And the real concern I have is you could actually have a depression and stagflation at the same time. And that is quite a high option now in terms of actually what may happen.
Another question about how much can governments spend before, in terms of GDP before we get into trouble. This sort of leads into the MMT question about, are the Fed going to want governments to spend to help them out in the short term? Or does that then lead to governments saying, well, hold on, why do we need to get this money off the Fed? We're doing it ourselves now and it's working really well. So I think that creates an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, so the old theory was that the government balance sheet was a bit like a personal balance sheet. You can borrow on it a bit, but eventually you got to get back to sort of a normality. Now, the MMT guy says, no, you've got to understand, governments can, if they have a currency, can basically go unlimited and just keep going and keep going and keep going. And therefore, that can create a pool of funds that can be invested into, particular programs or whatever you want. And that's the challenge, because the question is, when you do that, is there a point at which you effectively end up devaluing the currency so much that then you actually find that confidence is sapped? And the second question then is it also conceivable that there is a limit? So, I remember one of the RBA senior people said, we don't know how much debt is too much debt. Now, I asked Michael Hudson, a very famous economist, in an interview I did a couple of weeks ago, how much debt is too much debt? And he said, when you can't pay it back, well, I can tell you that the amount of debt that exists in the system now, it can't be paid back. And we're already, I think, over that sort of precipice, as it were.
How to balance optimistic mindset, realistic outcomes. This is an interesting one because I know, you get it as well as us about being the fearmonger and whatnot. But I mean, look at what's happened, guys. This is what we've been sort of warning about and saying, at least get yourself educated on what you're going to do if this plays out, because there are too many people that were just, get on the property ladder, buy stocks, everything's great. It's only going to keep going up. Look how quickly it all turned sour. So, look, I'm going to be a massive bull when I think the bottom of the market's in, whether that's stocks or property or gold or Bitcoin, I'll flip. But at the moment, I think we have to be realistic, because it frustrates me when people are on beaches and no one's taking this seriously still, when you look at what's happened in America in 10 days.
Well, look, my view is this. We are not going to go back to where we were 6 weeks ago or whenever it was, right? Whatever the new economy is going to be post the crisis, it will be different. It'll either be a debt-ridden, massive, stagflating mess, or it'll be something different. There's no way we can just put the genie back in the bottle. It's gone too far. And look, I don't want to be identified as somebody who's only negative. I look for positives where I can, and there are some occasionally. But frankly, this has been going wrong for at least 30 years because of deregulation and because of too much debt in the system and because of too much lending to the household sector and too high home prices. There are so many people all on the same side of the fence, from central bankers through to bankers through to politicians, all preaching this same gospel and all getting themselves into deeper and deeper mess for short-term gain, not understanding the long-term pain.
Next question is about this moral, ethical dilemma between, stay at home versus go back to work in the economy. I think we've spoke about that a fair bit at the start. It's just every day we're going to get more evidence and we're going to have a clearer picture. But there's no point letting this overrun our healthcare system. Go and look at those videos on Twitter and Facebook from the ICU.
Yeah, you can't trade one off versus the other, right? You've got to deadly serious about stopping the health issue now, because if we can't do that, we don't have an economy.
Is the low Aussie dollar good for our banks? banks in a very interesting situation. I think the government's going to bail them out no matter what, Martin. But
Yeah, I am. I was asked a few weeks ago, do I have concerns about the banking system? And I said, well, it depends on what the government does. The Reserve Bank and the government has demonstrated that they're prepared to do whatever it takes to keep the banking system afloat, with all of the quantitative easing programs, with the very low interest rates, with all of the support. I'm actually now much more bullish about the fact that the banks will still be there, and therefore the risks of bail-in is probably lower than I thought it was. That's simply because essentially they can't think of anything other than keeping the banking system going. And that's because the politicians and the bankers are all on the same side of the fence. Of course, it puts the pressure on real households and real businesses, and that's the problem I've got. So this is all being done to prop up the financial system at the expense of the real economy. And unfortunately, that's the legacy that we're going to have.
Yeah, it's not so much the low dollar; it's the low or negative interest rates that have killed banks in Europe that the Aussie banks want to avoid. Next question here. Health reports about even if you survive corona, it can have ongoing impacts. I definitely think we've seen evidence of that. And the viral load is in multiple organs. So this actually gets into your spinal cord. Viruses can go everywhere once they're in the body, but it's mainly the lungs where it attacks that we know so far. So if you recover, yes, you can still have lasting lung damage, but some people won't have that. Anything to add at all, Martin? Or?
Well, I haven't really studied that other than to say I know from my wife's experience that once the lungs get badly impacted by this stuff, it's a long-term issue, and often people don't fully recover.
For sure. Mental health, this is in relation to landlords, given the fiscal safety nets of governments and whatnot. But I just think mental health in general, a few rules from working at home that I've got is, you have to take a break from the screen. If you can get out, if it's safe for you to get outside or in your backyard and get some sun, music every day, have a routine. It can be really lonely and crunching mental health wise to be isolated.
Yeah, one of my little tips, get a timer and set it for about 40 minutes. And every time it goes, stand up and walk around a bit.
Yeah.
Because one of the big dangers is sitting for too long in the same position, right? And that is by far one of the most debilitating things that you can do. So get up, turn around, shake yourself, and sit down again.
Do your kettlebells, Martin. Do your push-ups. I know you do those in between each 40 minutes.
Well, I don't know about push-ups, but I do a few other things.
Would love to hear Martin's thoughts on spending habits. So, yeah, that's a good point. The afterpays and things like that have been ripping higher, and we've been joking about, debt on top of debt on top of debt. Do people's attitudes change? The hubris and that we've had the 30 years without a recession, Instagram and these influencers, I think we're almost due for that cycle change, aren't we, Martin?
We've had a consumer economy. So our economy, more than half of the GDP is consumerism, right? In other words, buying more stuff. And my view is that that's got to change, because essentially we won't be able to afford it, firstly. And secondly, people have actually realized that maybe buying more stuff doesn't necessarily lead to more happiness, right? There are a lot of people, particularly younger people, who are using the likes of buy now, pay later apps to just buy more because it's cheap and easy. And, unfortunately, 20% get into trouble and have to pay late fees. More people are using payday loans and other loans too. We are frankly wired to borrow and borrow and borrow again to support the consumer lifestyle that people aspire to. That is the fundamental value question that we've got to, I think, address. And by the way, there's an alignment there with potentially, thinking about the need to have a more sustainable future as well. For
sure. Investment properties in self-managed super funds. We might skip that one. We're going to talk. We've got a self-managed super fund specialist coming on soon to talk about withdrawing out of your super. But just quickly, Martin, what are your thoughts on people touching their supers or that at the moment?
Look, if you've got a super fund with a lot of equities in it and values have dropped, and, the government's, for example, saying, well, you can pull out some money if you need to from your super fund, that value will have dropped. So you're locking in, you're crystallizing the loss, right? So ideally, what you don't want to do is crystallize the loss. So maybe if you've got money in a savings account somewhere within super, grab that rather than actually locking in the falls on the stock market. It's quite tricky. And look, you've got to think about this. Superannuation was meant to be a long-term savings scheme for retirement. If in fact now the government is saying, well, we can change that, we'll just, give them access now, what you're actually doing is you're actually then bringing forward issues from the future to now. So you might be able to have some money now, but when you actually get to retirement, you may not have enough. So it's a very significant dilemma, I think.
Last couple, guys, then we're going to get into these YouTube questions. Commodities, precious metals. Again, we really don't know if there's going to be another liquidity crunch and everything sells off. I think the case, and I know you're not necessarily a bull on gold or Bitcoin, Martin, but I just think the case for anything that's finite, once you start printing trillions or unlimited amounts of fiat currency, it makes a strong case for those.
Well, you should listen to Harry Dent. As I say, I interviewed him today. His view is that gold will be down to below 800.
Yeah. He's a deflationist. Yeah. Okay. Can governments refinance? Do you think we're going to see nationalisation, Martin, of banks or debts or the airlines or any of that?
Very, very interesting question. Look, firstly, we need a national bank. We need a bank that actually is investing in our future and investing in the things we should be investing in, not just more property lending. So that's the first point. Now, whether that's actually created by a failing bank or whether it's a new bank, not sure. But I think we will see some industries nationalised. I wouldn't be surprised to see the airline industries nationalised again in some way, because there are some that we need. And, there's a lot of regional airlines today saying, well, we're going to have to stop. And so suddenly regional centres who are completely reliant on the regional airlines no longer have access to the healthcare that they need and those sorts of things. So I wouldn't be surprised to see. That's why I said this is going to be a fundamental recrafting of our economy rather than just a temporary blip and back to where we were.
For sure. Well, Martin, I did want to try and wrap this up around 9 o'clock. So let's do some rapid fires from the audience, guys. If you see any, Martin, you jump in and I'll have a look through as well.
Okay. See what we said.
People saying you should be lucky just to have a roof over your heads and food on the table, and when you talk to your grandparents after living through depressions and wars, then maybe we had it very good for a long time.
I'll tell you a very quick story. My mum used to always keep lots of tins in the cupboard. I could never understood why. She lived through the Second World War and she knew what it was like not to be able to find things down the shop. I hadn't experienced that until the last couple of weeks. Now I get why she did it.
Very frustrating, Martin, particularly when it's your favourite soy milk or something like that. I think that's probably something we should touch on a more serious note is the psychology of people and that panic at the supermarkets and why people bought toilet paper of all things. And then the fighting when we actually know that there's heaps of reserves of food and, in Australia we make a lot of food. There's no shortage there. But it's definitely that panic of people.
It wasn't about particular shortages. It was about control. People felt that they weren't in control. They wanted to get in control. That's a psychological need rather than a particular need for toilet paper, right? And so basically that was what we were trying to see there. We were trying to see people who wanted to get some control back in their lives. And that is the psychology that's driving it.
A couple of things I'll just touch on very quickly with psychology. Look at when everyone tried to rush into gold and silver the other day, and we've been talking about if you're a day late or an hour late in these things, look at the lines are out the door. The day when the Aussie dollar crashed to 55 cents and everyone was messaging me saying, Nugget, how do I get out of the Aussie dollar and into US dollars? And I'm saying, this is like when everyone's asking me, how do I buy Bitcoin when it's at 20,000? People saying, how do I sell the Aussie dollar when it's at a 17-year low? I'm saying, guys, we're probably going to get a bounce. And here we are, up 12% this week or something. So it's those extremes in sentiment when you've got to realise you're being one of the herd.
There's a wonderful comment there from, I think it's Rude Boy, saying Australia is like a hopeless teenager. I think that's actually quite a good summary, right? We haven't quite grown up yet somehow.
When you guys speak of being totally invested in cash, how safe are the banks? I think you touched on that, Martin. And interestingly, the Fed said this week that they'll print infinite amounts of cash if people want to withdraw it and put it under the mattress. But I think then the plan is inflation. So again, they want to try and get you spending cash.
Inflation, of course, as I said, devalues everything ultimately, right? But yeah, the banking system is probably more secure than it was a month ago because of what's been done. That's quite interesting in our observation because they've demonstrated their willingness to actually throw whatever it takes to keep it going. So in a way, we should probably be a little bit more confident about keeping stuff in the banking system than perhaps a month ago.
Yes, but just be cautious, I think, when everyone tries to spend that all at once.
Yep.
No, but we only watch you for crypto. Stop talking about all the other boring stuff. Well, I think, Martin, if you've been watching our episodes about everything else, you're a very happy camper. Anyway. I think Austrian economics versus Keynesian economics, that's going to be a big conversation around, well, how can, like the Steve Keens of the world, how can all the smartest people in the world not see two financial crises coming? Yeah.
It's because of their frame of reference, and basically they don't think debt's important, right? If you don't think debt's important, then you just ignore it, and that's the problem. So Steve was right. I think he will be proved to be right in terms of property as well. But, I've spoken to a very eminent economists around the world, completely frustrated with central banks and politicians not getting the real understanding of why the economy is doing what it's doing.
Oh, yeah. And that extends all the way from the unis to some of the smartest people out there.
Absolutely. Well, Michael Hudson said, do you realize that, the publishing system within universities is controlled by the neoliberals? So anybody who doesn't have that particular frame of reference won't get published. So the whole academic process is also contaminated.
Can the Aussie dollar hit 40 cents? Look, I really think that they haven't used that cushioning yet, Martin. If we actually go into a recession or depression and people aren't using our commodities and our exports and everything that was propping us up, then if the RBA really starts to do QE, it depends on what the US are doing and everyone else. But I think watching it fall to 55 when things are only just getting started is a bit worrying.
Yeah, but we do have all of the raw materials, and we still have demand from other countries like China, right? So I don't think our dollar will go as low as some of the other currencies around the world. That's my own view, but still the US dollar will be a lot stronger. So I wouldn't be surprised to see it, below 50 again for some time, but I'm not sure it'll go massively lower.
Okay. I think we spoke about that in one of our very early episodes in terms of localization. I mean, at the moment, imagine if there was still a soup kitchen in every suburb, or, your local Salvation Army, and everyone was just going to help each other out, and there was still a butcher in each neighborhood and a grocery store in each neighborhood. It would be very different to this world. Or even just making of those masks and, distilleries making the hand wash, but we just don't make enough of things in Australia.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to have a big conversation later about the disruption of these global supply chains and why that doesn't work anymore. So that's a globalization question rather than localization. We need to bring more production back into Australia. We need to be investing, I think, in the next generation of capabilities. So that includes infrastructure and businesses. But also, I think there's a question about working local. And also, I want to underscore the criticality of all this social media stuff and the networks and doing more online. I think we're going to learn a hell of a lot about how we can actually do a lot more than we ever thought we could online.
Oh, absolutely. Distance working. Well, guys, that's been an hour. Please hit that like button. I hope you've enjoyed Martin taking his Friday night to spend some time with us. It's been fantastic. We've got a lot to talk about in next month's housing episode as well, I'm sure, Martin.
There's more data come out next week, which I think will be very troubling. So we'll talk again then.
Fantastic. Have a good night, guys. Self-isolate, wash your hands, look after yourselves. We'll catch you again soon. Cheers.
Cheers, guys.